Right, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what time you are watching this. So, it's been a while, but something needs to be addressed. Many, many years ago, Malcolm X said, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. And that still rings true today, except it's not just the newspapers nowadays, is it? We have grown as in the world of electronic media, social media, YouTube channels, uh, the meta platforms, and everything else that goes along with it. But one thing you may have noticed, as have I, is when it comes to the issue or the support shown to certain demographics, our voices seem to be suppressed. Now, one man who's no stranger to this, of having his voice suppressed, somebody who is a former member of parliament for Derby North, is my guest tonight, who is Chris Williamson.
I,
Welcome, Chris.
Majid. Hi, Majid. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Pleasure to have you on board tonight, and it's such
Thanks for inviting me.
thank you, thank you. It's a topic which I felt you would be the right person to talk with about because not only do you have a long-standing history of talking up against or challenging the status quo, but also you continue to do so, and you're no stranger to facing criticism in your career, even currently, as we have seen in recent videos with some of the news channels. So I know there's a lot to cover in terms of the whole. I don't even want to call it a conflict. Do you know what I mean? It's doing an injustice to the Palestinian just to even call it a conflict. There's no comparison here. But in the current circumstances and in this current situation, we have a lot of people who are starting to educate themselves of the historical background, exactly how these things happened. But we face another kind of a dilemma, which is the suppression of a certain view and the promotion of another view. Chris, in your experience, before actually we get into your experience, because it's obviously very important, there is a question which has somewhat become a meme now. The first question I will ask you is, do you condemn? I'm just joking. I'm just joking. I'm not going to ask you that question. But the question has to be asked. Um, why is that question asked? Why do the news anchors or why do people like Piers Morgan begin with the question, do you condemn Hamas?
Well, I think it's down to the fact that the Zionist lobby wields enormous influence over the mainstream media in this country. And I, as you know, Majid, present a program on Press TV called Palestine Declassified, and
Yeah.
we've been examining the Zionist entities' global war against solidarity with the illegally occupied people of Palestine. I make that point at the beginning of every show, and it's really quite shocked us, to be honest with you, the level of influence that the Zionist lobby has. I mean, and not just in the media actually, but really right across society. You know, from industry, from the arts world, the music industry, just generally, they have an influence which is quite corrosive, to be honest with you, and in particular in relation to the coverage of the genocide that we're seeing being perpetrated in Gaza. Uh, they are trying to, whitewash that and to draw some sort of equivalence, really. And as you say, the first question that is often put to guests who are putting forward a pro-Palestinian point of view is, do you condemn Hamas? I mean, and I've actually not condemned Hamas, and have made the point that in any event, the incursion that took place on the 7th of October wasn't simply Hamas anyway. It was the resistance axis. I mean, all the resistance factions have come together And when you have, after 75 years of oppression and terrorism, which has been inflicted on the Palestinian people by the Zionist entity, inevitably that is going to result in resistance. And resistance, armed resistance, is of course legal under international law. And as you know, Majid, every attempt at a peaceful resolution, from the Great March of Return, and you look at the Oslo Accords, etc., have all been spurned by the Zionist entity, and so there is no real other alternative left, it seems to me. And every liberation struggle in history has resulted in armed struggle. And as I've said, that is legitimate in international law, and the focus ought to be on the terrorism being inflicted by the Israeli regime on a daily basis. And it's not just the carpet bombing of Gaza. Obviously it's the West Bank and what we're seeing, and the pogroms which are taking place on a regular basis, the illegal settlements, the daily routine humiliations that they subject the Palestinian people to. I was looking at a video, funnily enough, just today, actually, of some of the prisoners, some of the captives, the hostages, you might want to call them, Palestinians hostages who were being transferred and being released. And they were being taken onto a bus, but they were blindfolded and stripped naked. And it's those kind of humiliations which don't make their way into the mainstream media. But thankfully, in spite of the best endeavors of the Zionist entity and the powers that be in the corporate media, they are failing to cut through to a large swathe of the public in a way which we've never really seen in the past. And that's thanks to platforms like yours, Majid, and the proliferation of social media. And so people can actually see the reality on their smartphones, and juxtapose that with the propaganda that they're seeing on the BBC and the ITV and Sky News, etc. Although I think the protests in the streets and the avalanche of real news that we're seeing on social media, and of course it has to be said, Al Jazeera, I think, has done a sterling job in actually providing a balanced coverage of what the reality of war is. That's, I think, forced the hand of the corporate media to actually, start to report, to some extent anyway, the horrors that are being visited on the Palestinian people by the Israeli regime.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I every time I watch Al Jazeera, I can't help but think how much of a contrast there is between what they're reporting and what we are seeing here within the Western world in terms of what's natively available for us. I just want to touch on a couple of things you mentioned, because there might be some viewers who might not, on this particular platform, understand or be able to differentiate in terms of terminology what we're referring to. Zionists, who are they?
Well, I mean, they're not just Jewish people. I mean, many Jews are not Zionists. Zionism is this notion that there's a homeland for the Jewish people. And everybody in the world who is Jewish has an absolute right under Israeli law to return to Israel. And the Palestinian people who have hundreds, if not thousands of years of ancestry in Palestine, are not allowed to return to the land from which they were expelled in 1948 and then further expelled in 1967. Because let's remember that Israel wasn't actually established until 1948 formally. People like David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, said long before actually Israel was formally established that they would accept the borders that were initially imposed, but ultimately they would expand to the whole of what he referred to as Israel. I mean, and that is not just within Palestine, but it goes into Syria, it goes into Lebanon, and so on. So that was always the intention. And of course, a lot of Christian Zionists, particularly in the United States of America, and they have a very powerful political influence, and people like Donald Trump played to that Zionist lobby, that Christian Zionist lobby, and that was one of the reasons I think that he moved the embassy, U.S. embassy, to Jerusalem. But you've got very powerful Israeli lobbies, Zionist lobbies in the United States, and indeed in this country. The so-called Anti-Defamation League, the AIPAC is another. In the United States, you've got BICOM, which is Israel Communications, a group so-called in this country, which do wield enormous influence over the political process. And when I was a member of Parliament, around half the members of the Labour Party were members of a group called Labour Friends of Israel. And it's been reported that up to 80% of Conservative MPs are members of the equivalent on that side of the political divide. And so they do, therefore, wield huge influence over policy. And that really accounts, I think, in large measure for the position that the political class has taken both in this country and over in the United States, and to be fair, actually, even in the rest of Europe as well. I mean, Germany in particular, and indeed in France, they've passed laws to try and prohibit sort of pro-Palestinian activism. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign is kind of beyond the pale for some of these countries. But in spite of that. And I think, again, coming back to the point we were making about the proliferation of social media and independent platforms like yours, in spite of that, even in these countries where, protests in support of Palestine have been banned, there's still been massive rallies, in France, in Germany, and really right across the world. This is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this, I don't think. And so, there has been a huge awakening, and I don't think this genie is going to be possible to be put back in the bottle, and I honestly think that the beginning of the end is the beginning of the end for Israel now. Before the latest Palestinian uprising, there was a poll undertaken by Channel 13 in Israel, a broadcast channel in Israel. You may be familiar with it. You may be familiar with this poll, Majid, but that concluded that, according to the findings of the poll, 28% of Israelis were considering leaving the country. That figure will have hugely increased, and indeed many have already gone. The economy is tanking. They've called up all of these reservists now, and obviously that's taken them out of their jobs. So that's having a kind of a knock-on effect on the Israeli economy, and the world is watching now, and not so much the political class, but certainly the wider general public. And so the informal support for campaigns like boycott, divestment, and sanctions will grow, and that's going to have a knock-on effect. And in the global south, we are beginning to see the political leaders taking steps to move against Israel. I mean, Bolivia's withdrawn it's broken off diplomatic relations, withdrawn its ambassador. I know the South African Parliament has also voted for that to happen, but it's down to the South African president to make that call in the end. So there are moves happening now that I think could see the demise of the Zionist entity. And it's interesting, a few years ago, Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, predicted the end of the Zionist entity by the end of this decade. Interestingly, and people like Yitzhak Brick, who is a senior former general in the Israeli occupation force, compared the population of Israel to the passengers on the doomed Titanic. So, many senior Zionists have sort of seen the writing on the wall before the latest, uprising and what we're seeing now. And so, world opinion has decisively turned against Israel, and even the United States are now putting pressure. This is the United States political class putting pressure on Israel in relation to the conduct of the war that they are waging against the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because at the beginning of this particular episode, after the October the 7th, there was unequivocal support which was transparent and apparent on our screens from the US. But since the last time, what's his name, who went over to Israel just recently, a couple of days ago, he met with the senior politicians. Blinken, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
And he actually said something to them which I don't think even they expected, because they were saying we're practically going to do what we want to do. But Blinken said, look, you may not have so much of in paraphrasing, so much of that support that you had before. The problem we see here is we have unequivocal support. When we have the US showing that unequivocal support, the UK automatically shows that unequivocal support. It doesn't. We don't see it thinking for itself, and it's on record them saying, well, when our partners, the United States, decide to do something, we will do it too. And what do you really make of that as a sovereign country? When you've got a lot of people within the country, there's obviously a disparity of views, and there's a big contrast and a big difference between the views held. But when you've got so many people asking public servants to call for a ceasefire, and they're saying no, not until the US does, what goes through your mind when that kind of thing happens?
Well, they're totally in the pockets of the US empire, aren't they? And I mean, this was something that Jeremy Corbyn, when he became the leader of the Labour Party, kind of broke that cosy consensus, where the UK played second fiddle to the United States, so he had to be taken down. And yeah, I mean, I think it's utterly shameful. Look, I mean, my view was, when I was a member of Parliament, that my role was to stand up for what you believe in, stand up for the people that elected you, stand up for what's right. And I was astonished a bit, Magic, really, to be honest with you, to find that I was in a minority of one, really, that was willing to stick my neck out. Because in the end, the politicians...
Why did you, Chris, forgive me for cutting you off, why did you, as a one-man army, stick your neck out?
Well, my view was that being a member of Parliament, being an elected representative in any capacity, whether it be a local authority or in Parliament, is that your role should be to act as a representative of the people that elected you, as I've already said, really, to stand up for what's right, to use that platform to stand up for what you believe in. I used to say, because I was leading a campaign in the Labour Party to democratise the Labour Party, to make MPs accountable to the membership, to force them to go through an endorsement process, an open selection before every election, so that when somebody got selected to represent a relatively safe seat, it didn't just become a job for life. Because the problem is that the members of Parliament, in my experience, are completely out of touch, not just with the members, but with the wider general public. And my view was that the membership was much more in touch with and in tune with the public than the MPs actually were. And so that was the reason, really. I just felt that obliged that to use that platform to speak out. And I couldn't sort of sit back and see people like Ken Livingstone, who was an icon of the Labour movement and one of the leading lights of the anti-racist movement. I mean, obviously before your time, Majid, but in the early 1980s, when he became the leader of the Greater London Council, the GLC as it was called, before Thatcher abolished it, he probably did more than anybody else in public office to advance the cause of anti-racism, and earned the sobriquet as a loony lefty, partly because of his stance on anti-racism. And then he was being pilloried and demonized as some sort of bigot because he had referenced an historical event that occurred in the 1930s, which is the Havara Agreement, which is the Havara Transfer Agreement, where the German Zionists reached an agreement with the Nazis to transfer prominent Zionists out of Germany to Palestine. And I mean, that was eventually scrapped. But I mean, the Nazis actually minted a coin in recognition of this agreement. Actually, if you can Google this and see, there is an actual currency, coin of the German currency at the time, commemorating that agreement. And for me, it was just what you should do. I've always done that. I mean, as a councillor, I used to do that. I mean, I used to get hauled over the coals by colleagues when I got elected to Parliament because I used to represent people against the council. I used to take the council to court where people were being threatened with homelessness, and I used to represent people who'd been unfairly treated by the housing benefit system. And some of the other right-wing senior councillors saying that I shouldn't be doing that, that's a conflict of interest. And their view was that you had to, represent the council. My view was, no, we're here to represent the people against the bureaucracy, not represent the bureaucracy to the people. And the same is true to a greater extent when you are a member of Parliament. But sadly, and it is a real sadness, that even people who I had the greatest of respect for, to be honest with you, I mean, I didn't have a great deal of respect for a lot of the Parliamentary Labour Party because they're all pretty kind of right wing. But some of the ones who I thought were principled and solid, when it came to the crunch, they put their career first and were not prepared to put their head above the parapet. And the old Labour movement maxim that unity is strength was just thrown out the window. And so what they should have been doing, and I kept saying to them, look, we need to draw a line in the sand. We've got to push back because, well, they're going to destroy this project. The Zionist lobby will destroy this drive to an anti-imperialist socialist government that we're striving to deliver. They're working to sabotage that. And unless we push back against it, it will be consumed by it. And they just weren't prepared to do that. And they weren't, they wouldn't speak up for anybody. And it wasn't just some of the prominent activists like Ken Livingstone and Jackie Walker, a prominent black Jewish activist who was the vice chair of Momentum, who had been suspended on a false premise. I mean, I spoke up for her, spoke up for other prominent Jewish people, children of Holocaust survivors, and many others as well, less well-known activists, because I just felt that was, you have to, look, if you've got an elected position, what's the point of it? It's not a career. I used to say, look, being an MP is not a job or a career. When you start treating your role as a member of Parliament as a job or a career, you'll start to make decisions based on what's good for your career. And that's what, regrettably, all of them did. But I don't know, maybe I'm daft, but I just felt that was the right thing to do, to speak out for what I believe was right.
Yeah, hats off to you. I mean, even now we see that's the case. A lot of people even now treat that role as a career, and they don't want to do or say anything which would potentially put a spanner in the works of their rising up the ladders. Going back to the media itself, there's some people think that it's some kind of a conspiracy, or some people might say, well, how can you, for example, the BBC, this is the British Broadcasting Corporation. Why would they have, or what kind of interest would they have in not telling unbiased stories or events? Well, stories is probably more of an appropriate word, isn't it, in this situation? But those of us who have an interest in how language can influence people's minds, thoughts, and behaviors, we often see a very classical example, just like we see in a lot of the Daily Mail, the Suns, those kinds of tabloid newspapers, where one form of description is used for one community and a completely different form of description is used for another community for the same crime, in inverted commas. When the BBC is reporting things to do with this particular conflict, then it's so obvious how the words such as so many people were killed in the Israeli side, and then some people died. There's a difference in the terminology. Killed to died, because it's a natural thing to have happened, and that obviously plays on the minds of people. And then some news outlets share stories of which the sources haven't been authenticated, and the news hasn't been authentic. Not even news outlets, but you've had President Biden talking about the 40 babies, and said, "Oh, I've seen the photographs," right? And
They
then they
don't
had to
exist.
retract. They don't exist,
Yeah.
and they had to retract that. But the problem we have is when something makes the headlines. Daily Mail, somebody did on one of these videos I was watching. Somebody did their research, and for the first 14 or 15 days of this particular conflict, Daily Mail's headline was all about the atrocities which had been committed in Israel, but no mention of how many lives were lost in Palestine as
Yeah.
for revenge. And that's a long time to go without mentioning the other side. And it's, when people say, well, you know, surely it's just a conspiracy that you're thinking that all these papers or all these newspapers. So when you've got the likes of Sky, CNN, Fox, Daily Mail, Sun, the Rupert Murdoch empire in general, why would the Rupert Murdoch empire be supportive of the Zionist regime?
Well, Rupert Murdoch is a Zionist supporter himself, isn't he? He was very close to Ariel Sharon. And his whole kind of record, the kind of groups and companies, charitable bodies that he's supported, and so on. There's stuff full of ex-Unit H200, the Israeli intelligence organization. Stuff full of those people at senior level. So he's got a very close kind of link to relationship with the Zionist project. But it was like it was Winston Churchill said, didn't he, that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And I may have mangled that a little bit, but I think that's a sense of what he was saying. And that's very, very true, I think, in relation to what happened on October the 7th, the talk about 40 babies being beheaded, the raping and pillaging by the resistance fighters, babies being baked in ovens. I mean, these things are absolutely absurd and really quite horrific and offensive. And also, of course, what you don't hear in the British media. I mean, I should listen to it, watch it more than I do. I tend to get a lot of my news coverage from the internet, from social media platforms, and from Al Jazeera. But I've not seen anything on the mainstream media, and there may have been something that I may have just have missed it. But the Hannibal Directive, which you may be familiar with, Majid, which is something that it's a protocol that the Israeli military adopted some years ago now, where essentially they will use maximum force to prevent any hostages being taken. Because back, I can't remember when it was now, but one Israeli soldier who was taken prisoner by the Palestinian resistance some years ago led to a huge number, I think it was over 1,000 actually, Palestinian prisoners being exchanged for this one Israeli soldier. And so this Hannibal Directive was adopted, whereby they would use maximum force and even to prevent people being taken hostage, even if that meant killing the people that were about to be taken hostage. Now, it looks to me that the Hannibal Directive was put into practice on October the 7th, because it's very clear. This is actually, ironically, being reported in the Israeli media, but I'm not sure it's necessarily been. Yes, it Haaretz exactly has covered this. I'm not sure it's made its way, if at all, or it's certainly not been given very much prominence anyway by the British media, where most of the people, or certainly many of the people who were killed on October the 7th, were killed by the Israelis. And many of the aftermath, much of the aftermath, which was shown on the Western media as evidence of Hamas atrocities, was the consequence of the Israeli occupation forces firing tank shells in the kibbutzim at some of the dwellings with which some of the Israeli captives were being held by the Palestinian resistance fighters. And in order to take out the Palestinian resistance fighters, they just took out everybody else. So similarly, when the resistance fighters were taking people back in vehicles, the Apache helicopters were deployed, and they used Hellfire missiles to basically take out those vehicles. And then these images were shown on TV, as I've said, as evidence of atrocities committed by the resistance factions. Well, they didn't have weaponry that was capable of doing any of that of magnitude of damage. And so where was the scrutiny of this information that was being presented to them? It was just accepted, as was this nonsense about beheaded babies, which just came from one guy, an Israeli occupation forces soldier, who was apparently an illegal settler, I believe, who gave this information to a very pro-Zionist reporter, and then she just repeated it, and then a bit like Chinese whispers, it got elaborated and exaggerated to the point where, you know, there's 40 babies, and President Biden has actually seen photographs of it. I mean, it's quite shocking, really, and you know, these people need to be called to account. But I think, as I say, a lot of people, in spite of the best endeavours of the corporate media and the political class, the people aren't convinced by this nonsense anymore. And indeed, in the very week when the British representatives at the UN Security Council voted to veto a resolution calling for a full ceasefire, the UK and the United States used their veto to prevent that. There was a poll conducted that week, and I suspect these figures have even increased now, Majid, but 76% of the public, of the British public, favoured a full and permanent ceasefire. And I'm not seeing it. There may have been polls taken since that, but I can only imagine that figure will have massively increased, given the scale of atrocities that we've seen. This is unbelievable. I saw another statistic, Majid, which showed that the number of children killed on average on a daily basis in Auschwitz was significantly less than the number of children being killed in Gaza. I mean, these statistics are beyond belief. And yet, if you get invited to speak on the corporate media, and some are worse than others, but if you stray from this pro-Israel narrative, this anti-Hamas narrative, then you are absolutely, shouted down. I remember going on one program and referring to Gaza as a concentration camp, which is what it is, and was absolutely pilloried for having the temerity to make such a comparison. But actually, perhaps a better comparison is not just a concentration camp, but a death camp. When you look at those statistics, and more and more people. I mean, look, the images they're just too difficult. They're just too appalling to look at sometimes. But it's really important that people don't look away. We need to see this. We need to know what is being done, because our politicians are supporting this. Imagine they need to pay a political price, at the next election. They can't just go blithely into the next election and thinking, oh, it's all plain, this is all, let's hope that a ceasefire has been secured by then. Oh, well, let's just put that behind it. They've got to pay a political price for this, because this is absolutely despicable. It's beyond the pale. It's far worse than anything we've ever seen. It's far worse than the apartheid system in South Africa. And that's not just me saying that. It's people like the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said it's considerably worse. People like Ronnie Casrals, an African National Congress veteran, who I've had a privilege to share a platform with on a few occasions. He said that to me personally, that it's far worse. And this is before what we're seeing right now. It's a long time before what we're seeing right now. And so we haven't seen anything like this. This is just, it's finding it difficult to find the words to describe the horror that is happening, and how the Western world is sitting on its hands and allowing this to happen. And look, I've have to make this comparison, Majid. Imagine going back 40 years when the apartheid regime was in its pomp, and there was pressure mounting against it. Imagine groups emerging in the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, Labour friends of apartheid South Africa, and demonising people who had the temerity to speak out about the imprisonment of people like Nelson Mandela, the slaughter, massacre at Sharpeville and so on. It's unconscionable. It simply wouldn't have happened. They've been laughed out of court for making such a preposterous assertion. And yet this is what we see on a regular basis now. It truly is. I mean, your Malcolm X quote is one I often use as well. It's very, very apposite, to describe what is actually happening now. Except that the media doesn't have the power that it used to have. And that's, as I say, thanks to the advent of social media, despite all their best endeavors to influence the algorithms, to limit the reach. Although since Elon Musk has taken over at X, as he calls it now, that has diminished somewhat. Although he's coming under enormous pressure now from the Zionist lobby, as I'm sure you're aware of, and he's having, advertising is now being withdrawn from him. It's quite incredible, and you get it from that level, that huge level there, even to minor by comparison. I was due to speak in Brighton when I was still a member of Parliament. I'd been suspended by this time on bogus allegations of facilitating anti-Semitism. I was due to speak about economics, believe it or not, about modern monetary theory and how an understanding of the monetary system and the using modern monetary theory as a window on how the monetary system operates could actually help to explain and deliver a socialist program. That was the kind of pretext of what I was talking about. Several venues were banned to me. We eventually booked a room at the Holiday Inn. The Holiday Inn were then subjected to an avalanche of abuse online, of abusive telephone calls, and it culminated in two heavies going to the hotel in Brighton, making a threat, basically making them an offer they couldn't refuse. But they were threatened with a worldwide boycott of the Holiday Inn should they allow me. I mean, who the hell am I? I'm just an ex-bricklayer from Derby to speak about economics. It's bloody unbelievable, But that's the scale of it, because the Zionist mentality have this maximalist approach. But I think that's actually, they've overplayed their hand now, and people have really seen through them. And trying to play the victim when they're visiting this incredible genocide, it's sick. And people see that, and that's why we're seeing huge demonstrations in London, people turning out in every town and city almost in the land in support of the Palestinian people, which is incredibly uplifting. But we've got to make sure that doesn't just end there. We've got to drive through to, and that means actually making these political changes, because it's all very well marching on the streets, but we want to see political change. We want to see our politicians putting pressure on the Zionist entity and, forcing not just a ceasefire, because that's not enough, is it? A permanent ceasefire is not enough, because all they'll just go back to the appalling apartheid system that's terrorized and oppressed the Palestinian people for 75 years. What we need is the dismantlement of the Zionist entity, just as the South African regime was dismantled. That has to happen, and that's what we need to be pushing for.
And that's a very important distinction, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people conflate Judaism with Zionism, and that's not the right thing to do, because because this is not a religious conflict per se, but equally, when people say, "Oh, you're anti-Semitic for criticizing the state of Israel," you got to separate the state from the religion. Technically, the Palestinians are Semites as well.
Well, they are Semites. In fact, they're more Semites than most of the Israelis are. The Israelis, most of the Zionists are from Europe. They're not Semites or Semites, They come from Europe, and they come from the United States of America, many of whom originally came from Europe in the first place. Because let's remember, the United States is a settler colonial entity. It's just that we didn't have the benefit of social media to see the atrocities that they visited on the Native American people. But that's, that we're seeing it now in real time. This is exactly it. It's a settler colonial project, and it has to be smashed.
100%. And so technically, you could even argue that not fighting or supporting the Palestinians' plight is anti-Semitic.
Well, you could actually. Yeah, that's right. But what the Zionists have done, Majid, as you'll know, is they've invented this new term, new anti-Semitism, and they've used the ridiculous IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which I think that's about 11 clauses, and about 6 or 7 of them relate to criticism of Israel as an example of anti-Semitism. This is ridiculous. There is a perfectly adequate definition of what anti-Semitism is, and it's in the Oxford English Dictionary. And it basically talks about, hatred or discrimination against Jews because they're Jews. I mean, it's very, very straightforward. We can all understand that. You don't need 130 or 140 words, or however many words are on the IHRA working definition to work out what anti-Semitism is, unless, of course, you want to bring in criticism of Israel. And, and this is where I think, Jeremy Corbyn, when he was the leader of the Labour Party, went wrong. I mean, Jeremy has a long-standing record of speaking up for the Palestinian people, but I think the people around him who were advising him advised him very badly. And I think what he should have done is to stick to his instinct, really, and to call out the phony anti-Semitism campaign that was being mounted to destroy him, to destroy the prospects of an anti-imperialist prime minister, getting the keys to 10 Downing Street. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and we are where we are. So we have to regroup, dust ourselves down, and use this outpouring of support for the Palestinian people, as I've said, to drive through some political changes. We can't allow the political class to just go back to business as usual.
100%. I mean, another thing that we've noticed, even in the mainstream news, is the continual quoting of Hamas's charter from 1988, which refers to the getting rid of, I'm paraphrasing again, getting rid of Jews, which was updated, I believe, in 2017, was it?
2017, and Hamas actually in 2017 even accepted effectively a two-state. I mean, they said they wouldn't recognize Israel, but they would accept the pre-1967 borders as a starting point. So, but you never get that. You never hear that on the mainstream media.
This is a very important point, isn't it? Because it's continually being framed, this argument that Hamas just want to completely get rid of Israelis and Israel altogether and the Jews as a nation, and they want to take over the whole of the territory. What they don't give you is the context behind what's actually happened in the last 75 years. And the only time they make it in the news is when there's a reaction to a provocation. When, I think, was it Trump, when he went for the official moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, there was a protest by the Palestinians behind the fences, because they're behind a fence, again, which people don't recognize. And it was a non-armed protest, but they were fired at with live bullets. When you're going to be firing at people with live bullets who are partaking in a peaceful protest, then not to justify violence with violence, but you're going to have to expect some kind of a reaction, aren't you? You can't just take it. You're not going to ask them to turn the other cheek.
No, well, they've tried turning the other cheek. Let's be honest about it. I mean, the Great March of Return was about turning the other cheek. It was an unarmed protest, people marching back towards the apartheid fences on. They were shot like fish in a barrel, using illegal weaponry as well, actually exploding bullets and killing medics tending people who'd been wounded. Journalists taken out.
Even now using.
Well, it's happening now, of course. I mean, absolutely. Well, I mean, just it's to an even greater extent. That's happening, and but yeah, it's a truly horrific situation. But I was just thinking about some of these things that haven't made it into the Western media, which are out there officially from even Israeli media and interviews and documentaries. And some of the things that I came across was, some of the things that came to my mind were the situation in the West Bank right now. And since the start of October the 7th and preceding October the 7th, for the last, 20 odd years, how much land has been grabbed, how many times settler extremists have thrown people out of their house, taken over the house, stolen their houses, killed people.
I think the only one time that one of the settler extremists was arrested was when he set alight a Palestinian baby in petrol. But that didn't make it into this news here.
Yeah.
You see, and this is what's sad, isn't it? Organ harvesting. There's a popular documentary with Israelis themselves explaining they have a lot of organs, and she goes to admit majority are not from Israelis themselves.
Yeah.
Prisoners who are kept in a fridge and not given the right for burial by their families for more than 20 years in some cases, including children. The application of military law for Palestinians and civil law for the Israelis, a different legal system, classic definition of apartheid, and the general settler extremism that goes on around there and how it's reported, how the BBC reported the youth marching into Jerusalem with their flags, and didn't explain to them that these were illegal settlers, and they were provoking the people who lived there, and desecrating Al-Aqsa compound, which is the Muslims' third holiest site. So it's the narrative which isn't being framed correctly to give the wider context, which is a big concern. And for that reason, when we have conversations like this, people who are better informed or look at the counter narrative from other alternative media channels like Al Jazeera, like your programs that you have and the podcast that you have, Palestine Declassified, also found Double Down News on YouTube. And if you come across them,
yes,
Novara
I have. Very
Media,
good. Yeah.
Novara Media on YouTube as well. These are the types of news outlets or independent journalists who give you a more overarching kind of view of what's happening, a very balanced one as well at that, and it gets you to think independently to some degree, rather than just relying on the sources like the Skies and the BBCs. And so it's sad. But what do you see, Chris, as a solution in terms of the average public, the average person like me who's out, just wanting to understand, or people who are viewing this or listening to this later on, who want to try and understand the context behind it? What would you suggest, or how would you advise them to do that?
Well, I mean, I don't rely on the mainstream media for a start. I mean, by all means, obviously, what's the mainstream media? I'm not saying just accept what we say at face value, but to scrutinise what the mainstream media is saying. But look at these other alternative outlets that you've mentioned. I mean, Al Jazeera is particularly good. I mean, but the only station actually has got reporters on the ground in Gaza reporting. Many of them have been actually targeted by the Zionist entity, by the Israeli occupation forces. Indeed,
and their families.
I was just about to say that. I was just about to say, I mean, one of the prominent Al Jazeera journalists, his entire family was taken out. I mean, it's too sick for words, actually. The horrors that the Israeli regime visits on the Palestinian people. So look at those alternative sources of information. I mean, you mentioned Novara Media. That's another useful one, although they did get suckered into the going along with the bogus anti-Semitism narrative when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the party. Okay. But I think that some of the stuff they've been putting out more recently is better, a bit more balanced than that. But yeah, I mean, look at that. I mean, and come to the view. Look, I mean, the images are out there on social media. I mean, never mind looking at the sort of organised, established alternative media outlets and platforms like yours and others. Just look at what people on the ground are putting out there on social media, on Twitter or X as it's called now, and so on. But it's interesting that since Elon Musk has taken over at Twitter, now X, it is more of an outlet for freedom of speech, but even that is being curtailed somewhat. It's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. I mean, I was shadow banned on on Twitter. The number of followers that I had was going down every single day. I was labelled as Iran state-affiliated media. The same was done to my colleague, Professor David Miller, who was sacked from his job at the University of Bristol because of his critique of Zionism. But that's no longer the case. So that's interesting. But and we've got a program coming out soon on Palestine Declassified about X and Elon Musk, because he's got some links to the Zionist entity as well. But he's coming under enormous pressure now with advertisers, withdrawing their advertising revenue and so on the platform. But just briefly as well, going back, just thinking about David and what happened to Jeremy, I think that the failure of the Labour leadership to stand up to the Zionist lobby, to stand up to the bogus anti-Semitism campaign, has resulted in it ballooning to an extent where it's taking out people like university professors, where it's having an impact on people's careers in academia and industry across the piece. People, are very fearful now of speaking out. I mean, I know that doctors and pharmacists have been targeted for expressing a pro-Palestinian sentiment, and I think a lot of this can be traced back, to the timidity of the political class to actually call this out in the first instance. They saw that. I mean, it was pretty obvious. I mean, I used to say to Jeremy, stop saying sorry and stop giving ground, because you're just feeding the beast and making it bigger and stronger. And that's what's happened. I mean, it has become an enormous monster now that is consuming people. But David Miller actually has just taken an employment tribunal, and I was observing it, and from a layperson's perspective, it went incredibly well. From David's perspective, I think a very cogent case was put forward. The witnesses from the University of Bristol who sacked him were very poor, actually, and couldn't really justify the decision that they'd taken. Because David, had been subjected to two internal inquiries, two QC-led internal inquiries, both of which concluded that there was no case of answer. There was no evidence of any anti. He'd done nothing anti-Semitic in any shape or form. And after the second inquiry concluded that, the university management still said that they were going to dismiss him because he didn't meet the standards required by the University of Bristol. And so that's the backdrop to what we're seeing here. And so that does obviously have a chilling effect, and people are fearful, and particularly if they're younger. I mean, it's not so bad for me. I'm semi-retired now, so it's easier for me probably to speak out maybe. But for somebody who's in the middle of their career, they may have a mortgage and a family and so on. It does concentrate the mind, and people understandably become reticent, and that's why I think the political class need to be speaking out volubly about the importance of freedom of speech. And those of us that maybe the consequences aren't so great for, people like myself, we have to do everything in our power, it seems to me, to speak out loudly in favour of freedom of speech, because the consequences are very shocking, actually.
Well, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, these things seem to be applied very selectively when it comes to this particular situation. And you can see that just by looking at how people have behaved. You've got politicians on the one hand who have their own responsibilities and who have come out of the woodworks and shown themselves to be who they really are. What was his name? Stuart Seldowich, I think.
Stuart Seldowich, yeah, in the United States, yeah.
Yeah, in the United States, who was throwing some really abusive rants.
Very abusive.
At the halal stall over there, and in the movie industry as well. I think is the actresses in the Scream franchise.
Susan Sarandon, yes, she's just been dropped by her agent because of her support for the Palestinian people. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what's happening. I mean, Stuart Seldowich was a prominent official. could speculate, he was radicalized, if you like, by, his period working for Madeleine Albright, who said it was killing 500,000 kids in Iraq was a price worth paying, when through the sanctions that they'd imposed on the
Yeah, but Chris, how can you get people like that in those influential positions? He was in Barack Obama's. He was his advisor,
I know.
and he was in the
Yeah.
UN
Yeah.
group, wasn't he? Where he was representing or
Yeah.
actually advising on this particular issue. And you think to yourself, well, if you got people like that representing your state, can you just imagine what else is behind that? If you look at even Elon
Yeah.
Musk and the fact that somebody who's the richest man in the world, he's gone over to Israel. He had there was some criticism of him being anti-Semitic because of something that he'd said earlier, and that was before his visit. And some critics are saying, well, he's only gone there to win them back again. And if you think to yourself, if it's not money, what is it?
Well, I think money is partly it. It's also an ideology, but it's also it goes to the heart, really, of the unsuitability of our political institutions, actually. And I think it makes it all the more important that more people pay closer attention to the political process, because they can only get away with this because people are effectively asleep at the wheel. And one of the things I've been passionate about really for all of my time, and I've not been very successful at it, actually, I suppose, in one way you could argue, in terms of raising political consciousness of the masses, really. Because, and Tony Benn used to make this point.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but you're right. Okay. The things that you do, even what you might think are insignificant, gives motivation for other people to rise and say something as well, and it's catching, and it helps motivate people to gather that strength. One of the first videos I made when I came back on social media this time, because I was off for about 8 months, I was enjoying my detox. One of the first videos I made was to do with having the courage to say something, because it's not that we don't have fears. We all have fears. And I know some of my associates in business, they've not said anything. And, there is a fear of something. But being courageous doesn't mean you don't have fear. It just means you do the right thing despite fear. That's what the courage is. And you're going to have fear about certain things, whether it's an opportunity, whether it's status, whether it's losing clients or losing support in something, whatever it is. But if you can't speak for the truth, your own values, then what values do you have? It's questionable.
No, I agree. And I think there's a greater onus on people in political life to do the right thing, because that's what they're supposed to be there to do. To a much greater extent, really, than people, in business and, working in industry and working in the public sector, because it's the political class that actually set the scene. I mean, they could actually, defend freedom of speech. They could make it possible for people to feel able to speak out for what's right, to speak out against genocide. God Almighty, that's so important that more of us do that. I mean, indeed, more and more people are doing that. Let's not get, ahead of ourselves and somehow, think that, that's not happening, because it clearly is. And you just have to look at the number of people that are turning out on the street. But no, you're right. I mean, I guess the important thing is what we need to be, or the way we need to think about it, I suppose, is that, we're planting seeds in that sense. And you feel like, giving encouragement, and that is an important point that you make, Majid. I mean, planting those seeds, and hopefully that will, come to fruition in more and more people. I mean, I often talk about, I've recently joined the Workers' Party. It's a small acorn at the moment, but acorns grow into giant oak trees, and our purpose isn't just to grow one giant oak tree. We want to grow a forest of oak trees, and I think raising political consciousness is really key to that. I mean, not just in relation to international policy, but also in relation to domestic policy as well. I mean, we're the sixth biggest economy in the world, and we've got 14-15 million people living in poverty, and precarious employment is endemic throughout the land now. People are dying on the street because
But yet we're
That shouldn't
happy
be
to.
happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yet we're happy to provide arms and support
Exactly.
another nation,
Absolutely.
which is using the same material for. But let's just face it, it's illegal what they're doing. And
Exactly.
under international law, if what you're providing is there, if there is doubt as to whether it's going to be used for legal purposes or not, then you shouldn't be doing it. And talking
Precisely.
on the legal point, the was it the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, I think her name
Albanese.
is.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, and she said there's a technical difference legally between saying Israel has a right to defend itself and Israel has a right to protect itself, because as technically it's not right to say Israel has a right to defend itself from a technical legal perspective, because it is the occupying power.
Exactly.
It does
Yeah.
have the legal right to protect itself, but as the occupying power, you have to flip it, because you have to say the occupying power actually has the legal duty to protect those who it occupies. But this is the
Precisely.
other way around. It's not actually protecting those who it occupies against its own people, as in the illegal settlers who are usurping the land and committing all sorts of atrocities. And that is true terrorist behavior, what they're doing over there. Since this is all erupted again, and let's face it, it's been erupting for many a year now, many decades. And in recent past couple of months, we've heard about how many children have been taken into prison as young as
Yeah.
14. Why didn't the news? I mean, did you hear about Israel having an issue referring to children as children? They wanted to call them
Yeah.
minors.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see the
Yeah.
language thing that we were
Yeah. I
talking
do. Oh,
about
yeah. Very
earlier.
much so. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they can arrest people under the military law for I think it's 60 or 90 days at a time without charge, and renew that over and over again. And there've been people in there for many years
Well, they
without
have
being
this
charged.
administrative detention, don't they? Thousands of
Mm,
people in administrative detention, no charge, no due process, no
yeah,
knowledge as to when the imprisonment will come to an end. The conditions can
yeah,
best be described as dungeons, really, not you know. And actually juxtapose that with the treatment of the Israeli captives that the resistance fighters took, to
yeah.
the way in which the Palestinian uh, hostages, let's call them that, have been treated. Totally different. I mean, the abuse is beyond anything. But you know, where is the International Criminal Court on this? I mean, I know
Mm,
that there's been
mm,
some talk now, but you know, they issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin because Russia moved kids from a
mm.
war zone to places of safety, and they were then accused of kidnapping them, but they were moving kids from a war zone to places of safety, and an arrest warrant was issued for that.
Mm.
And
Double
Benjamin
standards.
Netanyahu's regime, how many kids have they killed now? Is it 5 or 6 thousand children?
Close to 6,000 now, yeah.
So many thousands have been injured. I
Well, and if
saw
you
some
look at the
statistic.
statistics, yeah, I was going to say, if you look at the statistics in the last 2 years of the Ukrainian war, less people have been killed than in the last 2 months of
Yes,
the
I know
number of people killed in Palestine.
exactly.
So you just can't compare the numbers.
No,
Yet there is a blatant hypocrisy and double standard being applied. And if you watch even some of the UN representatives, they were talking about the moving of a population from one place to another for safety. It's illegal. Blowing up hospitals or targeting hospitals or places of worship and sanctuaries is illegal. But they were talking about what Putin was doing in Ukraine,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and they
yeah.
won't apply the same standards for what Israel is doing in Palestine. So that kind of hypocrisy is blatant and it's obvious. But it surprises me and it's shocking that people don't see it that way. They can't link the two. You listen to any of these top tier politicians from any of our countries, whether it's the Western countries, whether it's UK, Europe,
Mm.
or America, and when they're talking about what Russia is doing without mentioning Russia, if you just blanked out the name Russia as a country's name, you think that they're applying that to Israel, but they're not. It's
Yes,
actually
indeed.
the opposite. And you think,
No, indeed.
wow, I thought you
Yeah,
were talking
absolutely.
about
Yeah.
Israel for a second, and
No,
they just
no,
won't do
indeed,
it.
indeed, 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 indeed. I mean, of
It's
course,
crazy.
Russia's been subjected to a an information war as well. I mean, no talk about the fact that the Putin, the Russia put a peace and security proposition in December of 2021, which was peace and security in Europe, which was thrown out. The fact that NATO issued the Bucharest Declaration in 2008, saying that Ukraine will become a full member. It will become a full member of NATO. There's no mention of the US and EU backed coup in 2014 that installed a puppet regime. No mention of that coup regime then actually mounting a civil war against East Ukraine and banning the Russian language in a country where 1 in 3 people speak Russian as their first language. The fact that
Mm.
14,000 people had been killed in those 8 years, that the former president of Ukraine said that they're going to make the children of the Donbass cower in their basements, that Zelensky's goons and the Azov battalion actually full of literal Nazis. It says a literal Nazi battalion that's been incorporated into the Ukrainian military. They were massing on the border of Donbass for a major military offensive immediately prior to the Russian invasion. So none of that context is actually put into play. But then when you talk about the consequences of Russia's military operation, and then, like you say, if you do blank out and the way that's
Mm.
spoken about and blank out the name Russia, you think, yeah, they're talking about Israel. But as I say, Russia's also been subjected to that information, misinformation.
Mm.
Let's put it like
Yeah.
that. That the corporate media and the political class indulge in. But NATO, is a hostile military, bellicose military alliance that really should have been disbanded when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991,
Well, you know,
which is a whole other story. Of course, we could have another program about all that. Of course, I'm sure. But
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, we were talking obviously about shadow banning and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I usually get hundreds of interactions with any post that I put up,
right,
other than this particular topic. But whenever I put anything up on this particular topic, I barely get double digits.
right.
And it's obvious to me. And when people ask me, "Oh, are you sure?" And it's obvious to me. And those people who are connected with me, they can see it for themselves. Those people who are putting up posts, they can see it on their own platforms and on their own
Yeah, yeah.
walls as such. That the posts that they put up relating to this particular topic, it's always going to be suppressed. Likewise, this particular video will be suppressed, but there will be a few people who are regular interactors with my posts who will see this, and I would kindly suggest that they do interact with it, even if you're just watching it. Just give it a like and share, because just that alone helps with the algorithms for us to be able to get the voice heard on a wider platform, and that's how these algorithms work. So when you watch content, or when you I mean, I didn't used to do this as much before. Even now, when I'm on YouTube, if I have anything that's showing a balanced view, or showing the counter narrative,
Mm.
I always interact with it. At the very least, I'll give it a like, so that the algorithms know this is something that's important, or it kind of boosts up the
Yeah, yeah. Of
um,
course.
the coverage. So if you're watching this, guys, whether it's live or you're listening to it afterwards or watching it afterwards, please do give it a like and a share if possible. And on that note, Chris, it's been wonderful to have you on here. Maybe we should do this another time, because there's so much
Yeah. No,
more to
thanks.
cover, and there's so much we
No,
can
indeed.
talk about.
Yeah,
I
of course.
wanted to
Yeah.
make this specifically on media coverage, because, as you know, historically, like we've already spoken about the historical background and the current context, but historically, there is so much more to unpack. We haven't even
Yeah.
touched on some of the things that are happening in the West Bank in as much depth as we would like. And there is no Hamas authority in the West Bank, yet 3,000 people have been imprisoned. Some of them have been injured and killed by Israeli settlers. Their homes are being confiscated. Women are being gagged, and they've got their eyes covered, and then been thrown in, and then been threatened with assault of a sexual nature, and said, "Did you see what they did on October the 7th? I'm going to get all my guys." These are the reportedly the Israeli soldiers from the IDF saying that to the women, and some have been sexually assaulted, and they are now starting to speak up about what's going on. And there's one thing being patient throughout the whole of this ordeal, and you'll hear the Palestinians always saying Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, Allah is sufficient for us, or Alhamdulillah in every atrocity and every difficult situation, meaning all praises to God. There are shopkeepers who have lost their businesses, their buildings have been flattened to the ground, and then all they will say is Alhamdulillah, praises to God. They're still thankful to the Lord. And a very unusual phenomena has overtaken the Western world now, where we see headlines where young Americans are beginning to read and look into the faith of the Palestinians because of how much faith they've displayed. They're looking, well, how can a people go through all this and still be thankful to God? What is it about this faith? So it's important for us to understand that, yes, some of them may not speak up because they're observing patience, but there's a time for patience, there's a time for activism, and a time to at least for us, the way I see it is, yes, they're being tested, but so are we. We're being tested to see what we would do as a response when people, whether it's whether it's in Palestine or anywhere else in the world, when people are being oppressed, what are we doing? And that's our test. So this is a small part of our test that we're trying to do something about it, whether it's raising awareness or giving education to people and the viewers. So I'm very much grateful and thankful to you, Chris, for being here with me today and sharing so much time. I know you're semi-retired or retired, but you're still, you're very much in at the forefront of leading these campaigns. So genuinely appreciate it.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Majid. And if your viewers want to tune into my Palestine Declassified program, it's available on Rumble. It's also on Twitter, and Rumble actually is a good platform to use if you don't use that already. You don't get the suppression because we've been banned. Palestine Declassified, you probably won't be surprised to know, has been banned from off YouTube, so you can't actually get it on YouTube now. But you can certainly get it on Rumble. So that's how I would recommend people to do that. But thanks for inviting me on there, Majid. I've enjoyed speaking with you, mate, and good luck for the future. And keep doing what you're doing. More power to your elbow. Keep getting the message out there, mate.
Thank you. Yes. You too, my friend. And to everybody else who's watching and listening, have a good evening, and we'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care.
Bye-bye.